I'm delighted to introduce David Allen. I'm most proud of him because of the fact he's a former student of mine who went on and did well. But let me read a short bio on David. David Allen is a chemical and biological issues analyst responsible for providing all source intelligence analysis to the Secretary of State and other senior department officials. Allen is also responsible for intelligence support for several policy areas, including U.S. participation in the Australia Group and efforts to interdict transfers of weapons of mass destruction-related technologies. Prior to joining INR, he served for 2 years as a foreign affairs officer in the State Department's Bureau of Non-Proliferation, where he helped manage a $60 million program designed to provide opportunities for former WMD scientists in Russia and other former Soviet countries to redirect their skills towards civilian applications. Well, what happened with that, huh? They found those Russian scientists there in Iraq as late as 2001. You weren't doing your job there, Alan. He had a short-term assignment as a political officer at the U.S. mission to the OSCE, where he helped support participation in an OSCE ministerial by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. He was awarded the Department of State's Meritorious Honor Award for service on the department's Crisis Task Force following the terrorist attacks on the U.S. in September 2001. Allen received his MA in Public Policy and BAs in Public Policy and Russian from BYU in 1999 before being recruited by the State Department as a presidential management intern. So I'd like to give a nice welcome to David Allen.
Let's see. Can you all hear me with this thing? I'm gonna try and wander around a little bit, and hopefully that'll work for me. Thanks for coming. And before I start, I also want to say thanks to Corey Leonard, Valerie Hudson for inviting me home to Provo to speak, and Marilyn Richards, who did all the setup for this. I very much appreciate them coming and also you being here. What I'm going to talk about today is U.S. government efforts to control the proliferation of chemical and biological weapons. Before I start with that topic, however, I do need to tell you that anything I say today is my opinion. I didn't ask Secretary of State Powell or anybody else what I should say, so if you asked him the same questions, you may get a very different answer, and of course he's in charge, so his opinion counts, not mine. Before I start, I want to talk just a little bit about INR, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, because I suspect prior to maybe 6 months ago, probably very few people in the country even knew that the State Department had an intel shop. I don't want to talk very much about this, but I just want a few highlights. 1947 was when the Bureau came into existence. Basically, at the end of World War II, the Office of Strategic Services was disbanded, canceled in 1945. There was some thought that the analytical functions, at least of the OSS, were worth keeping around. And so in 45, the analytical shop was transferred to the State Department. It didn't last very long. It was disbanded about 6 months later by Secretary of State Burns. But then in 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall decided that having an analytical shop at the State Department was the right thing, and so the Office of Intelligence and Research was created at that time. We've been in existence ever since. Basically, we're an independent organization. We report directly to the Secretary of State. Independent is sort of important because we're quite a bit different than any other bureau or office at the State Department. They all are under an obligation to basically support what the Secretary says. You know, if the Secretary comes out today and says policy X is the right one, everybody at the State Department, then policy X is now the right decision, the right policy. INR is a little bit different in that because we are an intelligence organization, not a policy bureau, we tell the Secretary what we think. And in fact, if we tell him we think he's wrong, that's what we write. We've done that several times. Sometimes it works. You know, it's his decision whether he wants to take our opinion or not. It's our job, it's our duty to give the Secretary our best guess as to what's going on. We really try to add value. We're not up here. We're not there to try to compete with CIA or anybody else. We're basically there to give the Secretary and other senior decision makers another voice, someone else that they can turn to. And last but not least, we represent the State Department within the intelligence community, so we get to work on things like national intelligence estimates and that sort of stuff, which you may have heard about recently. Wrong line. All right, on to CBW proliferation. Basically, the thesis or the starting point for everything I'm going to say today is this right here. Proliferation of CBW, and not just the weapons themselves, but also materials, technologies, expertise that make CBW or that contribute to CBW are a problem. It's spreading. More countries are gaining knowledge about chemical and biological weapons and how they can be used. Obviously, we have terrorist groups that we now have to worry about. This is not really a new threat, so to speak. I mean, CBW has been around for certainly decades. Mustard gas was first used in World War I. There were biological attacks in World War I and actually long before that as well. But it's sort of a topic that nobody really thought a whole lot about. Everybody was interested in nukes, nuclear weapons. Obviously, nukes make sort of a much larger immediate impact, and so that's kind of what everybody's worried about. That sort of has started to change as a result of a few occurrences, and a lot of you probably know these as well as I do. 1984, you had chemical weapons use by the Iraqis against Iranian forces during the Iran-Iraq War. You had both mustard and nerve agent. Iran subsequently responded with mustard gas attacks on the Iraqis. A little bit later on, of course, Iraq used nerve agent and mustard agent against Kurdish rebels. Following the first Gulf War in 1991, we had the UNSCOM experience in Iraq, where chemical and biological weapons were discovered, biological after several years of looking for them, and finally only after Hussein Camel, who was a son-in-law of Saddam's, who defected and finally gave us the initial clues that we needed to start looking for the BW and finding it successfully. You had the 1994 attack in the Tokyo subway where Aum Shinrikyo used sarin nerve agent to kill 14, I believe, and made several hundred sick. And then obviously in more recent times you had the Amerithrax or the anthrax letters, and then in the last couple of months we've had ricin mailings to post offices in South Carolina. We've had a ricin letter sent to the State Department, and then of course the ricin letter sent to Senator Bill Frist's office up on Capitol Hill. So it's this sort of thing that's really started convincing people, both in the United States and also internationally, that chemical and biological weapons are really something that we need to take seriously, and we need to start thinking about how do we deal with these things. In order to start sort of dealing with the weapons themselves, you really got to start thinking about why are folks after CBW? What are their motivations? Now, a lot of these things are going to look pretty familiar because a lot of the motivations that drive people to go after chemical and biological weapons are essentially the same as convince people that a nuclear option is something that they want. There's a perception out there that being a WMD-armed country really gives you something in terms of power and prestige and the ability to influence your neighbors or your not-so other countries, so to speak, to do certain things, or equally important, not to do certain things. And that's where the deterrence factor comes in. There's pretty good evidence, for example, that the Iranian chemical and biological weapons program had a nuclear weapon. For some countries, a nuclear weapon isn't an option. They're not capable technically of getting there. And in many cases, if you can't get a nuke, maybe a chemical or biological option is something that will work for you at least in short term until you're on your way to a nuclear weapon. With terrorists, you got to think instrument of blackmail and terror. Think about those ricin letters. As far as we know, at least at this point in time, the ricin letters, at least the first two, were sent by someone claiming to be a trucker who evidently is quite angry about federal trucking regulations. And he's basically sending ricin letters as a threat. If you don't change these regulations, you're going to get more of this sort of thing. the terrorist incident in Tokyo with the sarin that I've already discussed. That was essentially a terror attack. And finally, unfortunately, September 11th sort of showed us that terrorists are willing to kill a lot of people if they can. And a biological and chemical weapon is possibly a way to do that. There are a number of trends that we see in sort of the overall proliferation networks, particularly with regards to chemical and biological. The first trend is advancement. And basically, you've got some programs out there. When I talk about programs, for the most part, I'm talking about country programs. Programs are getting more advanced. They're learning to do things that they didn't know how to do a couple of years ago. They are out there looking for technology. They're aggressively looking for technology is actually the way you have to put it. They're seeking it wherever they can get it. They're seeking advanced stuff, stuff that you would find certainly in laboratories here on this campus, but also in industry. Very much. Things are getting better in a lot of the world. You have self-sufficiency. Right? These countries, it used to be that a lot of these countries were content to go out and buy what they wanted. That's how the Libyans got their chemical capability. They bought it essentially from the West Germans. That's how the Iraqis got their chemical and biological capabilities. They essentially bought it from the West. But the problem is that as people have started to realize that CBW is a problem, they have started taking steps to try and restrict the technology from moving. And as a result, a lot of these countries are now not so much trying to buy chemicals, they're trying to buy the ability to make chemicals inside their own country. And that is going to cause us problems because a lot of what we see and a lot of the way we monitor country programs is we monitor them in terms of transactions. And if they're not buying things because they can make it themselves, it's that much harder to stop transactions and figuring out what they're doing. Denial and deception is one we talk about a lot these days. Countries are really taking steps to try and make it harder on us to figure out what they're doing. They're hiding transactions. They're using middlemen. They're using cutouts where a country or an entity will be buying something fully intending to ship it somewhere else to hide the end use. Some countries are going underground, which makes it extremely difficult to monitor what they're doing. And the other thing that we're seeing that really is a cause for concern, we certainly saw it in Iraq prior to the last war, is we're seeing companies or entities that they look legitimate, but they're buying this stuff, and in some cases we think what they're doing is they're buying it, they're integrating it into a commercial production line, fully intending to switch it at some point in the future into military programs. Worldwide procurement efforts. A lot of times when we talk about procurement, we tend to think that countries like Iran, North Korea, Syria, they're after stuff from Russia, China, and they certainly are. But they're also after stuff from Western Europe. They're after stuff from the United States. They're basically after stuff from wherever they can get it at. Now, it's important to note that in a lot of cases, what they want is they want state-of-the-art technology, mostly from Western countries. It's better, it lasts longer, you get better quality for the amount of money you pay. But these countries are fairly pragmatic. They will do whatever it takes. And if I can get something from China that may not be as good, in most cases I'm going to take that because it'll work for me. And finally, what we're seeing in terms of state programs is we're seeing a gradual dispersal of knowledge and technology. The problem, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, but the problem is a lot of this equipment, it's not unique to CBW, chemical and biological warfare. It's pretty ubiquitous stuff. It's stuff like fermenters, dryers that are used widely in technology. And the bottom line is that as you develop a chemical industry, you are developing the capability for a chemical warfare program at the same time, even if you have no intention. Same token, if you can make vaccines, you can make biological warfare agents. And last but not least, I think this is the future. 10 years ago, we didn't think about terrorists in terms of weapons of mass destruction. WMD was a state problem. That's obviously changed. Shimnerko in 1994, again, the sarin in the Tokyo subway. Osama bin Laden is on the record as saying that the pursuit of weapons of mass destruction is a religious duty for Al-Qaeda. So again, state actors, I think, or non-state actors is really where it's going, and we're going to have to think, are the tools we use to go after state programs, are they going to work, are they going to be effective against non-state actors, or do we need to start thinking about different tools, different ways of doing business in order to get to these people? This is the big problem in chemical and biological, is you got this dual use problem. Again, everything for the most part that you use in a chemical or biological weapons program is also used in legitimate industry, up until the point that you put agent in a weapon. You know, there's no legitimate reason to have anthrax in a bomb, but there are legitimate reasons to have anthrax for research purposes, for vaccine purposes, for biodefense purposes. You get chemical and biological processing equipment, fermenters, chemical reactors. It's the same equipment. General lab equipment, containment facilities. And the kicker is right there. What we see a lot of times is we know that you have countries that we're concerned about that are getting this type of equipment. We see it. A lot of times they actually come to American companies and they try and export it from the United States. The problem we face is that we almost never know what the end use is, what the intended end use is. We have a stated end use, but you always have to wonder, is that accurate? And so you're always fighting this battle, particularly when you go to your foreign partners to try and get help on this sort of thing. Is it legitimate? Is it illegitimate? How do you know? And what's the standard of evidence that you're going to use in order to try and stop things? Having said that, the United States is in fact committed to trying to stop the spread of chemical and biological weapons. The President has spoken about CBW several times, preventing the spread of chemical and biological weapons and rolling back CBW programs is in fact in the national security strategy of the United States. It doesn't get a lot of ink, but it certainly is there. We are committed, first of all, to making sure that our house is in order by destroying our particularly chemical weapons stockpile. Tooele, of course, Anniston, Alabama is now also incinerating nerve agent. And we're also committed to helping others get rid of their stuff. We're in the process of right now of building a multi-billion-dollar facility in Shucha, Russia that is going to burn Russian VX nerve agent. We're behind schedule due to a couple of different things, but that effort is starting to move. We are also, as you might know from press accounts, we are involved in Libya, and we are currently in discussions with the Libyans about the 30-odd tons of chemical weapons that they've shown us, and we'll be involved, I'm sure, in the future in helping them get rid of that in whatever way they choose. For the purposes of this talk, what I want to focus on is we're also committed to preventing or at least making it harder on states, particularly countries, to get chemical and biological weapons. It is a policy goal of the United States. We do that through several ways. We have a variety of tools ranging from international legal conventions down to unilateral actions through diplomacy, some assistance programs, that sort of stuff. Talk about some of those as we go along. Basically, the traditional arms control method of preventing chemical and biological weapons, very similar to the Non-Proliferation Treaty on the nuclear side, Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention. Excuse me, BWC has been in effect since 1975. The CWC came into effect in the early 90s. Basically, over 100 countries, 100 plus, have signed both of those. The CWC, the newest member is Libya. Libya became a member of the CWC on February 5th, and they deposited their first declaration under the treaty on March 6th, so just last week. Basically, what the CWC and the BWC both do is they establish a norm against the possession, use, or proliferation of chemicals and biological materials for military purposes. In particular, Article 1 of both treaties requires a country not to have chemical or biological weapons and not to assist any other country in their development. And essentially what it does is it establishes this legally binding international norm that essentially makes it illegal under international law for other countries to maintain CBW programs. It serves as a way of alienating those countries. They are obviously they're not in compliance, and therefore it's much easier to take steps against them. And essentially what it does is it really justifies other action against them that might not otherwise be thought of or considered. But there's some obstacles to them, and I'm sure some of you have heard about these as well. The biggest problem with the CWC and the BWC is that countries cheat. If you had a situation where everyone would sign it and then everybody would live up to their agreement not to have this stuff, then the conventions would be wonderful things, and that's all you'd really need. Unfortunately, we've got pretty good evidence that, for example, the Soviet Union signed the BWC one day, and essentially they started their offensive BW program the next, because they basically thought that if all these other countries were going to give up BW, it means they'd have an advantage if they had one. They then started and eventually created the largest BW program ever in existence, 30, 40 facilities, 8 or 9 different types of biological agents, smallpox on intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at U.S. cities. But those countries are in good standing. If you go to a meeting of the OPCW, which is the CWC implementation organization, you sit around a table with the Iranians and some of our other friendly countries. If you go to BWC meetings, a lot of the countries that we are convinced have biological weapons programs are there participating in good standing. They help to define the debate. They help to decide where we're going on these types of things. It makes it very difficult to actually get anything done in terms of enforcement or verification provisions. The other thing is verifying compliance under these conventions is extremely difficult. Under the BWC, it's essentially impossible. The only compliance mechanism under the BWC is to take it to the United Nations Security Council, which can then order inspections, as was done in Iraq. As you know, though, certain countries on the Security Council have a veto. So imagine trying, if you were convinced, for example, the Russians had an offensive BW program and you wanted to inspect Russian facilities, that'd be rather difficult given that the Russians could veto the inspections on the Security Council. On the CWC side, there's a little bit more intrusive verification and compliance, and it doesn't prove that this country is cheating, then it essentially will call into question the entire validity of challenge inspections. It's going to make, it will make, in this case, probably the United States look very foolish, and in the end, it's not going to resolve any concerns about what that country is doing. So I wouldn't expect a challenge inspection anytime soon under the CWC. The other problem that you have is treaties are only legal if a country signs it and ratifies it. You've got a number of countries out there that for whatever reason have refused to sign or ratify the CWC and the BWC. Not just the so-called axis of evil either. Israel, one of our better friends, has still not signed, well, actually, excuse me, they've signed but not ratified the CWC. As a result, Syria basically has said that until the Israelis sign it and ratify it, we're not going to sign it and ratify it either. And so you have a subset of countries that are essentially outside of the legal requirements of these conventions. So essentially, because of the obstacles, decision was made a number of years ago. It's not a new decision that the CWC and the BWC in and of themselves simply isn't enough to try and stop these things. That basically has led to the creation of a group known as the Australia Group, which the Australia Group came out of the old export control system where countries banded together to try and keep the Russians or the Soviets from getting certain technology. The AG was founded back in 1984 after it became clear that both the Iranians and the Iraqis got a lot of their stuff for their chemical weapons programs from, well, among other countries, us and the Western Europeans. Now, the basic idea of the Australia Group is to try and make sure, it's a group of countries that have essentially agreed that we're going to make sure that countries don't get CBW stuff from us. It is a regime of like-minded countries that have agreed to cooperatively harmonize export control lists and then control exports of those items to countries of concern. Now, it's important to note the AG is not a treaty. The AG is a political commitment, so there's no legal consequences for violating the Australia Group agreement. However, it is well understood by the countries involved that if something is on the list and it's going to a country of concern, that basically the presumption should really be that that thing is denied. Each country really makes its own decisions, though, and in fact, some countries on occasion will approve exports to Iran, Syria, Libya, the countries of concern. The other thing that it's important to mention about the AG, particularly in connection with the CWC and the BWC, both of the conventions have articles in them that essentially mandate cooperation in biological and chemical trade. The CWC is the most specific. It basically says that countries that are members of the convention are not allowed to put in place any sort of export controls or other provisions that do not coincide with the treaty's purposes. And what they're trying to say is that the treaties are not intended to stop trade in chemicals. It's intended to stop proliferation of chemical and biological weapons. All right, so likewise, the AG is not intended to stop trade in chemicals or biological materials as long as the trade, as long as the materials or the equipment being transferred cannot support a CBW program. So in fact, the United States does transfer, we allow things to be transferred to the Iranians, medicine, agricultural products. Those are the two big ones. The basic idea then is we don't object to these countries having medicine. What we object to is them having the technology that can then be used to create chemical and biological weapons. That then brings to export controls, which is the way the AG really works. And what an export control is it's really a tangible commitment. It's the way you show your commitment to nonproliferation. Because an export control requires that before an item is transferred, you have to come into the U.S. government for an American company or to the British government for a British company, and you have to get an export control license. And really what that does is it provides the U.S. government in this case with the opportunity to weigh the value of that export in terms of a chemical and biological weapons program against the value of trade. We're not out there to try and mess U.S. companies up. We're not out there to try and take money out of their pocket, which is something we're accused of on occasion. What we are out there to do is to make sure, that U.S. technology and U.S. companies are not advancing or contributing to these illicit programs. This is interdiction is a topic that you've possibly heard a lot about. Anybody recall the Sosan? The Sosan was a North Korean ship carrying Scud-B ballistic missiles from North Korea to Yemen. It was stopped by Spanish forces, boarded, seized, all of that sort of stuff. That was really the primary example of an interdiction. An interdiction, at least the way we use it at the State Department, is really doing something active to go out there and stop a transfer that is occurring. It's a little bit more involved in an export control, where you stop a transfer before it starts. Interdictions are sort of the watchword of the new administration. They were really concerned when they came into office that we were being way too passive, and we needed to get out there and we needed to actively show countries that if they were involved in this kind of trade, that they could expect to see us and that they could expect that essentially bad things would happen to them. The goal is really to stop the proliferation from happening. It's not to embarrass another country. It's not to gain information. It's to stop the transfer. The problem with an interdiction is you really have to have good information. And it's got to be timely information. In order to stop something from happening, it does me no good to learn today that it was transferred 3 weeks ago. I've got to know today that it's going to be transferred 2 weeks from now so that I can set things up and do what I need to do to get my assets in the right place to get things stopped. That is a challenge. And I wanted to provide two examples of where timely and accurate information have made or broken an interdiction. The first one's the more recent one. P2S5 is phosphorus pentasulfide. It is an industrial chemical. It's used in, among other things, brake fluid. However, it's also a key precursor for V-series nerve agents. There was press reporting out of Taiwan that indicated that a North Korean ship had put into port in Taiwan this last summer of 2003, carrying a load of what was declared on international shipping safety documents as undisclosed chemicals, which is basically a short term for I've got a bunch of chemicals on board my ship. None of them are dangerous. They're just sort of industrial stuff, nothing to worry about. There was information out there, though, that what the North Koreans were calling unspecified chemicals was in fact P2S5. Again, a key nerve agent. And more importantly for this case is P2S5 is a dangerous chemical that's required to be declared as such under international shipping regulations. So the Taiwanese were able to go on board that ship. They inspected it. They figured out that it really was P2S5 on board. And as a result of the North Koreans' failure to declare what it really was, they were able to take it off, and the North Koreans went along and didn't get their chemicals. That's, I think, an example of an interdiction that really worked right. There was information that was timely, and more importantly, it was accurate. And we were able to go to allies that work with us, and we were able to get the job done in I think, a way that really showed that the United States was willing to work with other countries in order to stop trade in illicit chemicals. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work this way. The INHA is a more historical case. Some of you, I'm not sure if some folks might remember this case. This was a case back in the mid-'80s. I'm sorry, 1993. Basically, in 1993, the INHA was a Chinese ship. And in 1993, there was information out there that the INHA was on a route to Iran carrying two chemicals, thionyl chloride and thiodiglycol, both of which are mustard agent precursors. These chemicals in particular really have no commercial use. So we were pretty sure that they were going to illicit purposes in Iran. As we usually do in cases like this, we approached the government of China. We essentially said, you got this ship out there, we know it's carrying illicit chemicals, we want you to stop it. They did an investigation, they came back to us and they said, we've investigated, there aren't any chemicals on board that ship. Essentially, we decided that we didn't want to take that assurance, and so we worked with the Saudi Arabians and the Chinese to arrange for the ship to stop in Saudi Arabia, where U.S., Chinese, and Saudi officials went on to inspect it. And unfortunately, in this case, it turned out the Chinese were right. There were no chemicals on that ship. Information, yes. Accurate, no. And unfortunately, this is a case that we still hear about today, particularly from the Chinese. It's an example of where our information was unfortunately incorrect, and it really did, in fact, it caused us a lot of problems. PSI announced by President Bush in 2003, essentially the Sosan incident showed us that we didn't know what we were doing. We had to do everything. We had to set everything up new every time there was a shipment. PSI is intended to try and get agreements ahead of time so that we know what we're doing. We have everything in place. We get information. We can act on it very quickly. Sanctions are something that we also use quite a bit. Sanctions are mandatory for certain transfers under U.S. law. Basically, the point is we try and hurt people economically for doing business with illicit countries. Unfortunately, a lot of our proliferators don't do any business in the United States. Most of our sanctions basically have a prohibition on trade with the Americans. If you don't trade with Americans anyway, sanctions don't hurt. So this is a problem. In some cases, they can be effective. In some cases, they are less than effective. These are really the cooperative programs. Export control assistance. We help folks set up their licensing system, set up their border control system. We spend a lot of money, we spend a lot of time helping a lot of countries on doing export controls better. This is the program that I worked on when I first went to state. We spend something like $60 million trying to give Soviet scientists and now Iraqis and Libyans the opportunity to do science, but to do science in a way that isn't going to contribute to CBW programs. As Dr. Hudson mentioned, sometimes it's less than successful because we can really only get to the ones that want to cooperate. And unfortunately, there are people that have made a decision that they can make more money by cooperating with countries like Iraq, prior to the war than with us. As I mentioned before, we're helping Russia, now Libya, one or two other countries destroy existing chemical weapons stockpiles. And the Dangerous Materials Initiative is sort of the newest. It's not quite up off the ground, but what DMI essentially will do is it will help countries secure stocks of biological pathogens at research facilities, make it more difficult for terrorists to get in, also do things like make sure you know how much anthrax you have so that if some of it disappears, you know it's gone. That program is starting. It was just funded, so it's just getting off the ground. And finally, there's diplomacy. We talk to a lot of people. Under the Bush administration, what we have really started doing is non-proliferation is a topic of everything we do. We bring it up in the United Nations Security Council, the OSCE, the Conference of State Parties at the OPCW, the G8, and we have really made it, I think, clear to a lot of these countries that doing business on non-proliferation is a part of the relationship with the United States. Now, how are we doing? I know we're almost out of time, so I'm going to do this really quickly. The good news, most countries aren't going after CBW. That's a good thing. Most countries have decided they don't want it. Our cooperation is expanding. We're working with more countries more closely. The Proliferation Security Initiative is moving along. We have agreement, and I think that cooperation is going to expand, and it's going to keep on going. The Iraq WMD threat, whatever threat there was, is gone. Maybe they didn't have it, maybe they hid it, but whatever it was, it's not there anymore. We're pretty sure of that. The Chinese, in the last 2 years, China was really a proliferation problem. They would sell almost anything to anybody. In the last 2 years, as a result mostly of U.S. diplomatic efforts with the Chinese, they have put into place a fairly good set of export controls. They are taking steps to enforce their export controls, and they're getting a handle on the proliferation problem, which is going to be a major advancement for global non-proliferation. And finally, the Libya story, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Gaddafi's announcement that he is out of the WMD business is good news. We're not really sure why, I don't think completely, but we are fairly convinced that he's serious. Cooperation on the ground has been excellent from what I understand, and I think this is really a success story for global non-proliferation as well. Unfortunately, there's some bad news as well. We still do have rogue states that are out there pursuing CBW. Some of those countries show no indication of wanting to get out of the WMD or CBW business. Iraq was a good news. To a certain extent, Iraq is also bad news, and that is that at least at this point, we have not been able to publicly account for what is perceived to be disparities between what we thought and what we found. And the question is, and I don't have an answer to this, this is a question. The question is to what extent will that perceived disparity hurt U.S. credibility when we go to our partners and say, we have a non-proliferation issue that we need your help with. And last but not least, proliferation is still occurring. We still see it. People are still selling all kinds of things to all kinds of countries. Conclusion, basically, and again, this is very personal. This is not State Department policy by any means. What we're doing is making it harder. We're costing them more money. We are slowing them down. And in general, we're making their life tough, which is good news in my opinion. What we're also doing is by slowing them down, we're buying time for us to do things like develop vaccines, develop detection technologies, develop some of the things that are going to help us deal with a CBW event, either in the United States or against U.S. military forces. That's another good news story, I think, as a conclusion. I think sort of a semi-good news, semi-bad news thing is, in my opinion, all of those efforts that I've been talking about in and of themselves aren't going to necessarily be enough to stop CBW proliferation. I think we can slow it down. I think in order to stop it completely, you've really got to look more on the Gaddafi model. You have to figure out what it is. Why do these countries think CBW is right for them? How do you get them to make a decision to change their minds? And then you go about doing that, and at that point, once you eliminate their perceived need for these weapons, I think you'll also eliminate what we see in terms of countries going out and getting them. So it's a good news story. there's more work to be done, I think, addressing fundamental motivational issues as opposed to the symptoms that we see in individual transfers. Finally, what I thought I'd do is I'd throw up a few useful websites for you. Australia Group, history, it has the control lists. These things here are all U.S. export controls. If you're interested in seeing what the United States controls to which countries, those are where you could find it. BXA is our organization at the Department of Commerce that's in charge of going after U.S. companies who violate export control regulations. And then finally, the Bureau of Non-Proliferation at State Department contains links to the BWC, the CWC, fact sheets on the Australia Group, and that sort of thing. So those of you that are interested in more information, this is at least a start of places that you can go to for more information. And with that, I think I've talked long enough, so I will sit down and
take a few questions.
I'd be happy to take a few questions if there are any.
Probably have time for just a couple questions.
If anybody's still awake. Yeah.
You mentioned that you're reducing right now your stockpile of chemical weapons.
Yes.
What about biological weapons? Do you guys have some, or assume that you're not destroying them?
The United States had an offensive biological weapons program up until approximately 1972. In 1972, Richard Nixon ordered that the program be shut down. By about 1973, all of our production facilities were dismantled, and somewhere around 1974, all of our existing stockpile of biological weapons were destroyed. And since 1974, so 30 years essentially, the United States has had no biological weapons program, no offensive biological weapons stockpiles. Yes.
Is the dual-use strategy more difficult, equally difficult, say, in the nuclear theater?
On nukes, dual use is an interesting problem as well. Basically, on a nuclear program, you do have civilian uses of nuclear, mostly for energy purposes, nuclear power plants. But you get to a point on the nuclear program where, at a point after which the dual use problem ceases to exist. For instance, centrifuge technology. There's really no reason to need a centrifuge to enrich uranium above about 5% for power. So if I have information that somebody is interested in the technology to enrich uranium up to 90%, there's only one reason to have there's only one reason to have highly enriched uranium up to that point, and that's for a nuclear weapon. So there is a dual-use problem on the nuke side as well, but it's not as extreme. Again, on the CBW side, it's dual use all the way to the point that you put agent in a bomb. So the answer is yes, but not quite as bad.